All right, there we are. We are live again, off the cuff, with Dr. Corey Miller is kind of joining me tonight as we chat about some really good topics: Marxism, social justice, all those kind of things that are some important issues of the day. So, Corey, thanks for joining me. How are you doing today? All right, you guys staying safe with all the pandemic worries of the world?
Brother Miller, good to be here. Thank you. And yeah, we're trying to stay safe and effectively so far.
Yeah.
Though sometimes I think I need to go out there and get exposed, because how are we going to beat this thing without some kind of herd immunity?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm glad I'm not making the decisions. I've got a lot of complaints.
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm not the one.
I'm with you on that. I've seen some of your posts, man. Like I had a friend today just post, hey, you know, like they want to release all the people from the jails and stuff like that. It's not that I understand the concern. I just said, well, what does that mean? Because you read the articles that say it, but do you mean everybody? Do you mean like commute their sentences for the rest of life? Do you mean like with ankle bracelets? I mean, I just like, does that mean everybody? So sex offenders and, you know, first-time marijuana users? What does that mean? Release all the inmates? I don't know. I get a little concerned when people get on these bandwagons and don't know what they mean. And so it probably comes across on Twitter or Facebook that I'm being a negative on everything, but mostly it's just trying to figure it out. It's just so crazy. Man, do you find that hard, like to figure out what's truth and what's not these days?
Well, you get so many expert opinions, right?
Yeah.
The media, the sound bites, everyone's got their passions involved with this. And of course, we've got our own as well.
Yeah.
So you have to have some epistemic humility in all you're listening to, and
for sure,
hoping that some of those experts are throwing the socks on the wall and they stick.
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you on that. I wrote a little blog post years ago, actually about 4 years ago, sort of like it was a play off the old Aesop's fable, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. I said The Reporter Who Cried Trump. And it wasn't a political post by any stretch, just this sort of thing like when you say wolf, 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 or Trump, Trump, Trump so many times on everything, I said, you know, we're going to get to a day when people are going to really need to know what is the truth, and no one's going to know who to believe, because there's been so much bad, ideological as opposed to factual, reporting. And I think 4 years later, actually, we're kind of there. It's like, sometimes I just wonder, it's like, that sounds bad, but some people have proven themselves so dishonest in the past when I've been able to check. Now that I can't check, who do I trust? I just don't even know. It's tough.
Right. The name of the game right now with this madness is uncertainty. Yeah.
Yes. Uncertainty breeds fear, and fear is a heavy motivator for a lot of stuff. And that's, I guess the idea of fear, and I think negative things inspire people. And that's sort of very lead in. I want to maybe transition a little bit to our talk a little bit on Neo-Marxism and socialism. It's interesting because when I think of that term, I think of the name and what that is. I'm reminded years ago, back in 1991, before the fall of the Soviet Union, I got a chance to do a missions trip there, actually with Josh McDowell, and we were in Red Square. And I remember, you see there's the tomb there, Lenin's tomb, and all that sort of thing. And I think for a lot of Americans, when they think Marxism, when we say, hey, there's a show that's on Marxism, they're thinking of the dead guys that are memorialized in the former Soviet Union, Red Square, Hunt for Red October, or something like that. They're thinking this is a sort of dead, bygone era, and Christians are just trying to straw man some sort of argument against, in this case, maybe social justice, by trying to connect those two concepts. And so I want to spend a little bit of time defining those terms and why they're connected, and maybe setting the stage of where that is. But I think, to be honest, as I thought about this show and talking with you, one of the questions was, why should people, average Christians who never studied this stuff, who imagine the things I kind of described, why is this even why is this even a relevant topic for your average Christian who's just trying to survive COVID-19, is just trying to do their job as a teacher or a police officer, or just as whatever they do, as a garbage guy, or my friend who's a plumber or whatever. Why do they care about this topic? It sounds very academic and useless, I think, for many people.
It does, and that's one of the difficulties of addressing this topic, is because if you use the term Marx, it sounds conspiratorial.
Yeah.
You use some of the other terms that might, again, if you're throwing socks on the wall to try to get people's attention to say what this is, maybe you talk about social justice, you talk about identity politics. Social justice, though, sounds great. If you question that, then you must be some evil, greedy, right-wing Republican capitalist. If you say identity politics, well, that's just political. I hear that every night on the news. Turn that off. I hate that stuff.
Yeah.
What term is endearing to it? If you say critical theory, that's where the origin of this stuff comes from, but it sounds so academic that even the average academic's eyes glaze over. So It's difficult to address the issue without offending someone or putting them to sleep. But It is relevant, not only because ideas have consequences, and this one is real, but it also, for Christians, it's a gospel issue. If we don't understand what's going on here, many Christian leaders are being taken by this, and it is creating mission drift in some organizations, and in others, it's supplanting the gospel message.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the big challenge that you outline, is that I think Christians need to be engaged in this, even though they got to kind of resist that temptation to fall asleep or to just knee jerk. With the, you're talking about things, you're a big meanie, and sort of plow through that beginning part here and hopefully see that this has real applications for policy, for the way government, the choices that are being made of who gets what monies and where they go and what institutions survive and die at the hand of government, and how the power of institutions. I think there's really a lot of practical things, and it's just like you said, that's the challenge, is getting past that. So hopefully with that little bit of an intro, people will realize we know these are inhibitors, but I think it makes a difference in the daily lives of believers, of Christians, especially when it comes to their own churches and our schools and education systems, even Christian labeled, ones that are labeled Christian. So with that, maybe you could give, you've done a bunch of study on this. I know you've written a couple things on this. I know you've published in a journal article on this back in 2009. So you've studied this for quite some time, and you've had a lot of discussions and debates with folks on these things and dialogue. So what is a basic definition of Marxism that we could use to kind of guide us through this discussion?
Even that's a little bit difficult because there are Marxisms, right?
Yeah.
I remember in, 2005, I was taking a grad course at Purdue University in the philosophy program from a distinguished professor of philosophy, a Marxist. And when I was preparing to write a paper, which eventually got published in the International Philosophical Quarterly on Marx's Epistemology, I got so much pushback on that because Marx never had a systematized epistemology. He never had an ultimate view of reality, and there is no just Marxism. There's Marxisms. It's when you try to say this country is socialistic or that one is. No, socialism has never really been tried. So you can't point anywhere. It's always moving the goalposts. But to get some context, Marx had a view of reality. He wrote his dissertation on Democritus and materialism. Yeah. He viewed the world as a naturalist. He's a product of the Enlightenment, but isn't the naturalist like we think of, that's focused on scientific naturalism. He moves beyond that because he says that philosophers have always interpreted the world, but the goal is, after all, to change it. He was an ethical activist. He did have a theory of knowledge, and it was, of course, naturalistically driven. His view was not all,
Naturalistically meaning what in that sense?
what's that?
Naturalistic in what sense does that mean?
Well, certainly you're not going to have divine revelation to consider. Um, so
Okay, so
you
yeah, so
begin to,
rejecting the idea that God
yeah,
speaks to us, that God can kind of give us
he
his.
assumes the product as a product of the Enlightenment. He assumes naturalism is true.
Hmm.
He assumes that natural theology has been destroyed by Hume and Kant and other people. He never gives an argument against God's existence, and so certainly no argument against revelation as a form of knowledge. But he sees knowledge as a postmodernist.
Mm.
There's a sense in which he's reacting to modernity, where he is he's a student of Hegel, a student of Feuerbach, and very much a humanist. But he sees things through a particular lens.
Hmm.
We now call standpoint epistemology, through the lens of the oppressed.
Yeah. So truth is based on the perspective of the viewer, right? But when you're saying standpoint epistemology, I'm just, boiling it down. So standpoint epistemology being epistemology, what is truth? How do I know it? And so from my standpoint, this is what my truth is. So we get this maybe connections to these contemporary ideas. And there's big brushstrokes here, but maybe this idea of like, okay, this is my truth kind of statements. Is that where we might hear that sort of idea today? Do you think?
A little bit. I mean, that's part of postmodernity, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people confuse what is now Neo-Marxism or critical theory in this notion of social justice with postmodernism. Postmodernism, notoriously hard to define. You can describe it. It's a form of relativism, right?
Yeah.
But critical theorists aren't relativists. There's a number of streams of thought here, but those who are contemporary are standpoint epistemologists.
Mm-hmm.
They have a theory of knowledge that there are some truths that are objective, but they're blinded. Other people are blinded in some sense to access them.
Yeah.
Marx talked about a liberational consciousness that really is you almost have an esoteric access to knowledge. If you are in an oppressed class, you can see it much better. And once you become a current term woke, you've become awakened to this reality. You can see things. You can see racism. You can see sexism. You can see oppression and oppressors like no one else can.
Yeah.
They may not be consciously culpable of being a racist, but they are, or of being an oppressor, an economic oppressor, but they are.
So in Marx's view, so if you're a part of a certain, the higher, economic class, because his division is on economic lines. So if you're on this higher economic side, you can't see the oppression and the reality of those things because your perspective, you got these sort of blinders on, right? So you've got then these, the workers that are seeing the objective truth out there, and then therefore a revolution to try to compensate for that. What can't otherwise be resolved because you can't reason people towards something they're blinded to, I guess, in some degree, right?
Yeah, and then there is a sympathy from a Christian perspective about that because Christians say that non-believers are blinded by their sin.
Yeah.
Marxism, there are some who have tried to wed the two. Alistair McIntyre, who finally retired from University of Notre Dame, used to be a Marxist, became a Christian, wrote a book on Marxism and Christianity. His argument was that Marxism was the replacement of Christianity. It borrowed on certain Christian content and functions, the essential content and functions of religion. Marxism is very religious at its core. And that's what distinguishes it from, this wave of scientific naturalism. There's something very deeply religious about that, and it's ethical. So it's lively, it's attractive. People don't know the name, even if they're buying the concepts.
Yeah. Have you ever read, by the way, I'm actually reading through a book right now called Karl Barth and Radical Politics by George Hunsinger.
I haven't read that.
It's really good. He's got a lot of primary source stuff in there. Just some chapters are just whole letters from Barth, or Barth. I never know how to say his name, but because he was started as a Marxist, but basically, was a socialist and was supported the communist sort of party ideals, and has written into a lot of his literature. It's really, it's another show for another day, but when you brought that up, it just made me think of that book is a great. I would actually do chapter 1. Anybody teaching their students on socialism, I would say read chapter 1 and then discuss its relationship with Christianity. It's really a good read, short read, but really interesting. But
if people have never read Marxism, the Marx Engels reader, or if you've read Das Kapital or something like that, you can't help but empathize or sympathize at least with what he was seeing in his day in poverty, and wanting this bleeding heart coming out, and seeing the world from a vantage point of the oppressed and the oppressors. When we think of Marxism, we often think communism, and this is why people think this is conspiratorial. But this was Marx really was only interested in an economic notion, that when we think of socialism or communism, as his third criticism. His second, more important one, was political. Prior to that, it was religious criticism. That was his number one part of criticism, which is where we get critical theory and critical race theory and so forth. So Marxism is about class warfare. It holds that human societies develop through class struggle between the haves and the have-nots, concerning the means of production and wealth accumulation. But that's down the road. The more important issues are getting to the heart of the matter. And that's why Marxism and robust religion cannot coexist. Marx has to come in somehow and either through revolution overtake it, or through infiltration subvert it and bleed it dry.
Yeah, that's really that's fascinating to hear your telling of how that kind of how that comes together, and I think that leads to a good question where we are today. So a lot of times we hear the words Neo-Marxism or social Marxism, and I'll just give my sort of rough justice summary and then kind of lead you into a question. You can kind of correct where I'm wrong, but so I think one of the most significant differences, say, between Neo-Marxism and Christianity, Neo-Marxism being just sort of, instead of always economic disparity, sometimes it's disparity of, I think you mentioned race, or it could be gender. There's other issues beyond economic distinctions that sort of come into play. I think that's, my simplified version of that. But one of those things is, I think their view of what human dignity is, or the source, the foundation for human dignity. And so I think my take would be that, Neo-Marxists would ostensibly sort of deny this Christian argument that sacredness is inherent, to us because there's no creator that created us like that way. And so I think value ends up being more on a group level than on an individual level. So your value is sort of given to you based on what class of people you're involved with. So you can correct that assessment if you think is wrong, or maybe nuance it in some other way. But assuming you think I'm pretty close there, why is that distinction different? Say the difference between sacredness being given to the individual versus sort of, I guess I'll say, for lack of a better word, sacredness to the group, I guess. If that even makes sense to you.
Well, so if we can come back to the view of reality, right? If you think about philosophy being what is real, how do I know what is real? How should I then live based on what I know about reality? The view of reality is naturalism. The view of humans is a naturalistic view of humans, but it forms clusters in group identities. My identity is not, as the Christian world sees it, in Christ, or Christians are believers that in the sanctity of human life and the sacredness of life, because man is made in God's image. Marx, following Feuerbach, says that all theology is anthropology. We've learned that man was created in God's image, but really God is created in man's image. And Marx said that it's not religion which creates man, but man who creates religion. We form these blocks as a means of survival in oppressed communities. And we find our identity in those groups. And this is where identity politics or identity power comes in. Power to rise up, workers of the world unite up against the bourgeoisie. The proletariat need to rise up. And you were right. It's not just, financial class division. We're talking race, class, gender, religion, ethnicity. It cuts all the way down. People are haves or have-nots, victims, victimizers, oppressors or oppressed, bourgeois, proletariat. That's the view of reality of humanity. And somehow we've got to take away the disparity, because anytime there's disparity, that implies injustice. And what we want ultimately is equality. And that's the ultimate utopian community. Religion has promised us what we cannot have here on earth, we can have in heaven. Instead, we're taking heaven down on earth, and we're making this utopia, this egalitarian society now.
Yeah. I think what you're saying there helps maybe folks understand one of the reasons why when you read headlines, there's always a twist to it. So, there's a flood. I remember years ago, a tornado went through the Midwest when I was living in Oklahoma. Tornado went through, and one of the headlines I read the next day: tornado devastates, women, minorities, and children impacted most. And I thought, well, there you are. The tornado is racist and sexist, But I didn't realize at the time there's a worldview behind those sort of headlines, because everything is filtered through that lens of, class, social, race identity. There's a group identity. So every bit of information is some sort of evidence that these walls exist between groups. And the only way to shatter them is to take power from one group, give it to the other group. And I think that's where we get into this idea of social justice. That word, again, another difficult one. So I'm going to sense a theme here. I'm going to ask you to give a little bit of definition of social justice and how maybe it relates to Marxist ideology. And you can start by saying it's another difficult one, but because it is.
I'll just say simply liberation.
Liberation.
Liberation, that's the ultimate goal of it, is liberation. Again, we find our identity in groups, human horizontal groups, not groups that are divinely attached, right, made in God's image in Christ, but in human groups, black groups, women groups, LGBT groups, worker groups, oppressed and oppressors, and even those who think that they're not oppressed. He thinks that religion is part of, it's the sigh of the oppressed creature. It's part of the indicator that people are oppressed, that because of socioeconomic oppression, religion becomes the opium or the drug of the masses. The rich person in a rough world can purchase the good stuff, opium, cocaine, and so forth. Yeah. The poor people, poor in mind and poor in pocketbook, they can't do that, so they purchase religion. But once they're sufficiently enlightened, and once they've gotten goods distributed equally, a redistribution of goods, but like religion, it tells us what is good. Once that happens, once we have equality, once we have justice, remember, inequality means injustice. Anywhere there's a disparity, there is injustice around somewhere. And so the ultimate goal is to rectify in society, socially, the injustice by bringing about social justice, even if by coercion, if necessary.
Yeah. Have you ever read any of Reinhold Niebuhr's? Have you read his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society?
Yeah, it's been a long time ago, though.
Yeah. It's a fascinating read, isn't it? Because I read that, I was reading it I think, a couple years ago now, I can't remember, but it was at the height of sort of like the Black Lives Matter issues that were coming up. And I remember reading them and just being fascinated because where he sort of just used the word generically privilege or class, I think, okay, put in white privilege or put in, the word of the day, race or whatever. And the book is it's just, what I found so relevant is I think he was just so straightforward about what you're talking about. He talks about like the idea that, especially that disparity, because power, the inequality of power distribution is what you have to fix. And the way to fix that is by any means necessary. And this is why, I always think, that idea that when you give rights to a group as opposed to the individual, well, you end up as a guy like Niebuhr who says, well, it's wrong for, Corey Miller to kill somebody. But if it's done for the larger society so that you can bring, equality of power, it may be necessary. And so what's immoral for a man to do may be moral for a society to do, to bring this kind of justice. And so it's pretty direct, and it was really fascinating because you just don't get people, maybe because they don't understand it as well, or maybe they just want to, be more subversive in the stuff. But I found it fascinating because it's exactly what you were talking about there, that this idea of power disparity and how do you equalize that? I think that's a pretty fair definition too of like what social justice goals are. So when you say that, I think, here's the transition to the social justice side that I was thinking about. So when Christians, there's definitely a number of Christians that are growing and embracing the content and the substance of social justice activism. Sometimes I think it's out of fear because, like you said, I think at the beginning, you don't want to be labeled a hateful person or lacking compassion or lacking caring, or they say, well, it's because you're blinded. Like you were talking about, oh, you just don't see that there's injustice. You don't see it. But I think there's some other things at play there. So, and maybe I've answered the question itself, but I kind of want to get your take on this. Why do you think so many first are drawn to this issue of social justice causes? I mean, and maybe let me refine a little bit because I think you've started down this road a little bit. Where has the church failed in expressing the gospel that we have, I think, sent our young people towards a movement, which I think we would agree, even if we haven't established it fully, is maybe not as compatible as we'd like to think it is with the Christian gospel. Is there something we've failed in our lack of compassion? Is it failed in our education? Why are so many people drawn to social justice causes, often to the not recognizing all these things we're talking about the class and the power and the struggle that goes with that?
That's complicated. I think as human beings, from a Christian viewpoint, created in God's image, we have this moral law inside of us. We know right and wrong. I've been doing some studies in the last 2 years on the golden rule in comparative religions and in science throughout time and at a time. And it's one of the most simple, elegant rules and most pervasively known. And when, do to others as you would have them do to you. It's simple. You see it applied to something like the Good Samaritan. Everybody, for the first time ever reading that story or hearing that story, you hear about the first two guys that did the wrong thing. You all know what the third thing is. We come to know the golden rule by empathy. If we've not met it by divine revelation, or even if we have, we come to experience it by empathy. We see this. Compassion is part of our makeup, right? As beings created in God's image. And so I think there is this natural impetus, even though from a Christian viewpoint, we've got this dualistic nature, propensity to sin. Yet we've been created in God's image. We have this moral law within us. A lot of Christians don't want to get involved with the debates in culture, with the conflict. people go along to get along.
Yeah.
And no one wants to get tied up in the controversy of the LGBT stuff. I mean, that's a conversation stopper. It's a career stopper.
Yeah, I've seen you take some heat on that on Facebook for some posts.
Yeah, it's and the rhetoric of this is so powerful. It's hate or celebrate. What would Jesus do? And so Christians in particular are given over to a charge of guilt because we believe in a doctrine of original sin. We're used to being told that humans are sinners, that humans are blind to the things of God, and that we're unjust, that we're corrupt. And so when someone comes along and says it and then challenges us to do justice to the poor, well, we have a lot of that in the scripture.
Yeah.
God has a heart for the oppressed. He has a heart for the downtrodden. He has a heart for those who are inflicted. You see it throughout the Old Testament. You see it throughout the New Testament, and it's part of our psyche. And that's what, again, to sympathize with Marx, when he saw the world in these, squalor conditions, we talk about having a bleeding heart for people. I think that's what happens with a lot of the Christians, and in this culture, we're not seeing the problems with this because what we see on the surface is social justice means help the poor. And everybody wants to get on board with helping the poor, or at least you want to virtue signal and say you do. You want to help the downtrodden. You want to help the victims. And so the name of the game is today, if you can claim victim status the most, you get the attention.
Yeah.
And Christians are quick to give compassion because it's hate or celebrate.
Yeah. No, I think you hit a really critical point that I just reflect what I'm hearing. I think that's worth, let me rephrase it my way, I guess, just to see if I'm understanding what you're at. I think the reason Christians are drawn in part to social justice causes is because they're seeing it. I think for the most part, they see genuine issues. I mean, they see racial inequality. I think there is legitimate cases for institutionalized racism. It may not always be what they say it is, but I think there's some legitimate concerns with that. They see inequalities, income disparities. They see people in poverty, people in uber wealth, and they say, "Gosh, the gospel says, care for the poor, do these things," and so they see a way to cooperate with the culture without having to create conflict, where, hey, we can just do together. We can just accomplish this together. What God wants us to do anyway is take care of people and love people and help them. And so what I guess in the short version of what you're saying, and I know this is broad, but I think for many people, I think it's as simple as, hey, the social justice is the gospel. I've seen those slogans put that way. You can't have the gospel. Matter of fact, we just had a conversation Tuesday night with a group here locally of some missionary workers who are in different groups other than Ratio Christi, and I was the only Ratio Christi kind of connected person in there. But they were all saying that they go to some conferences and some trainings that they're doing these on critical race theory. They're actually being trained how to live these out. And they're told, you cannot have the gospel without social justice. And I think that's why people end up in that camp, because of that common theme of compassion and love, right?
Right. And that's just, it's a fundamental mistake to misunderstand the notion of justice. If we lose the right notion of justice, we lose the gospel. Because what social justice does, there was a term that we used for thousands of years. It was called justice, right?
Yeah.
And there was another term called compassion. We have similar terms, grace, mercy. But what social justice does is it comes along and it conflates those two. Mm-hmm. It confuses them. Justice is typically looked at as getting what you deserve, or what you've earned, or what is entitled to you by right. We have certain inalienable rights, right? Mm-hmm. I don't have the right not to be offended, but I have the right not to be killed, right? Certain negative rights like that. But justice is getting what you deserve. Until we understand that, and the wages of sin is death, we're not going to understand grace. Justice is being interpreted today to be anything that seems good for society. Taking people's wealth, giving is now called justice. Used to be social justice. Now it's just they're just reducing it back to the original term, justice. So justice is a matter of mercy. Justice is a matter of grace. Justice is charity. But those two terms are completely different. Justice is getting what you deserve. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. And mercy is not getting what you deserve. If we don't get it right on justice, if we confuse those, then we start to think people are even entitled for salvation.
Yeah. I think that's a critical piece is the biblical ideal of justice, where that stands versus the idea of social justice and what it is. So the way I've kind of come to think about this, and again, I was just having this conversation Tuesday night with a bunch of folks, and it kind of struck me as I think it's fair to say that both Christians and, say, your social justice warriors, whether they understand Marx or not, or Neo-Marxism, that's their underpinning behind social justice that allows them to see injustice. Christians have a framework of, we see the world through the lens of sin and the gospel, and we say, okay, but we're seeing the same bad stuff through a different lens. But I think the hard pill to swallow for Christians is they don't understand that the prognosis, what the neo-Marxist kind of social justice warrior would prescribe as the solution to the problem is where the conflict comes. In other words, the conflict is not we see people suffering. The conflict is not denying that those things exist. Sure, we can all agree that those bad stuff happens. The question is, what do we do about it? I think that's where sort of maybe the rubber meets the road, where, in my view, and you can tell me I'm wrong, do you think, well, I'll just ask it. So do you think, given that, is social justice a hindrance to the gospel? Is it necessary for the gospel, or is it completely antithetical to the mission of the gospel? As Christians live that out, where do we fall in that? I mean, how do we deal with that?
It's a bad term. We shouldn't use the term. We should use justice. We should use compassion. We should talk about grace. We should talk about mercy. The Bible's filled with commands to care for the poor, to defend the powerless, seek justice for the widow, the orphan, free the oppressed. Those things, we ought to be sympathetic with those who we might call social justice warriors or something, or anyone who sees injustice, genuine injustice happening. We should use care to adopt rhetoric that subverts Christianity. We need to stick with more, biblical terms. This notion of social justice it's a Trojan horse that has many different items in it. You've got environmental justice, LGBT justice, racial justice, heteronormativity justice, LGBT justice. Everybody's got their part in that horse. And most of the stuff that's in there from a Christian viewpoint is a matter of injustice. Oh, and economic justice, of course, right? So they not only redistribute the goods for the goal of egalitarian utopia or equality utopia, but they do it in a way that's coercive to get the job done, because that brings about justice.
Yeah.
And I think instead of that, you brought it up, that the right solution is the gospel. We need to meet the needs of the poor, but we need to not confuse what the gospel is. I hear Christians now saying social justice and the gospel are one and the same. But that's to conflate justice and grace.
Yeah, so they have to, I think, to merge social justice into the gospel to make them one and the same. Aspects of God's plan, his nature, his character, have to sort of be subverted somewhere, put to the side, is what kind of what here you're taking. I could think of a verse, for example, you look at different Old Testament passages. Micah talks about, bringing justice and all these sort of things and caring for those, and that all of a sudden people that have been impoverished are going to have wealth again, and all this restoration. But the context there is, I think there's two challenges. There is one, that a lot of that, with that comes a judgment from God against sin. And I think social justice doesn't have that sense of, there's no standard of righteousness within social justice. And a matter of fact, because the redistribution isn't based on, in the Old Testament, it's like, hey, when you receive these blessings, you get them or receive them based on your faithfulness to a certain set of laws and principles and where God is at. But, there's no way to get those blessings without being obedient to God, I guess is where I'd drive it at. But social justice doesn't really have that sense of obedience or respect or honor for God. Does that make sense where I'm going with that?
Yeah, and again, people who use the term and may not understand what's really behind it may be innocuous to some of the problems that come about through the Marxist elements or the critical theory elements or whatever. But what we need to take home is that social justice is the liberation. The liberation of what? The liberation of all forms of oppression. Mm-hmm. That's what you're being liberated from. It first found its way into Christianity in Central and South America by some rogue Roman Catholic priests and so forth. It migrated. The academic route came through, a Frankfurt School of Thought in Germany and through the Ivy League schools. But in terms of the laity, it came up through oppressed groups that were socioeconomically oppressed. You find it in some layers of black theology, like James Cone and other people.
Yeah.
It was called liberation theology, which is a hybrid of Christianity and Marxism, where the crux passage in Scripture is the Exodus. It's about getting the oppressive Egyptians off the back of the oppressed Jews. And salvation takes on a notion that isn't vertical, it's horizontal. It's leveling the playing field across the board. That's salvation. That's justice. That's social justice. It's equity. It's not just equality either. Equity is the term people are driving at now, and that is reparations, for example, right?
Yeah.
It's paying back wrongs due as well, not just bringing about equality. And it's doing it through human efforts. There's no forgiveness in social justice.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're getting to one of those key issues. You cannot have forgiveness. You can't really even have reconciliation. There's just an equalizing of power. Power
and privilege, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, which can be done by force. So if you have something and you have three of them and I have one of them, you have to give me one. And if you don't, it's going to be taken from you, whether you like it or not, and given to me. That is, I think, a lot different than the kind of giving and the need to take care of people that Jesus endorsed. But it's concerning too, I think, that there doesn't seem to be there's no end game in social justice. In other words, if you look at the gospel of caring for the poor and the needy, Paul gives a lot of instructions about what are the obligations of those who receive need, and there's a little bit more of a clear definition, at least in terms of how that functions maybe in the church, but also the end goal is ultimately salvation in God and righteousness and holiness. But for social justice, it just seems like, okay, there's always going to be somebody on the bottom. Let's put it that way. There's never going to be complete equity. So as long as there's someone at the bottom, something still needs to be taken from somebody else. Because as soon as you take the power away from one group and give it to another, that group by definition has power. So who's going to lead the next revolution to equalize the new power imbalance? So it seems like that what Christians should be concerned about is that we're playing into a system that leads to perpetual anger, to perpetual bitterness, and to perpetual revolution with no end in sight. Do you think that's a sort of a fair concern?
It can have that effect. because the means of bringing about this utopian egalitarian community is through coercion. It's not just equality, it's equity. Mm-hmm. And that is a Robin Hood mentality, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, and calling that justice.
Yeah.
And it's in every category. The Bible draws the lines not between genders or socioeconomic classes or ethnic groups, where your identity again is inseparable in those ways to your group identity, but instead it draws the line between those who are faithful to God and those who reject Him.
Yes.
And ultimate salvation is found in Christ. I think that's one of the ways that we have conversations about this, is to talk about, use the vernacular of oppression and so forth, but then get around to what the real issue is in terms of truth claims about Christ.
Yeah. I think one way that really leads to one of the last questions I want us to get into is, you've done a lot of debates and talks about this. Matter of fact, recently you had a really kind of hopefully what is a groundbreaking. I guess we'll see that more people are going to repeat this. But you had debated with Peter Boghossian. Am I saying his name right?
Yeah. Peter
Okay.
Boghossian.
Good. Yay. And he's an atheist, hostile by many accounts to Christianity. You guys met at several college campuses in Utah, right? And had a debate on, you didn't have a debate. You had a dialogue about some of these very issues, and sort of have an alliance to some degree, some sort of sense of agreement about the concern over some of these very issues we're talking about. So I guess that leads to that question: is what can Christians? There is hope in all this, I think, for me, is what I'm thinking, is that there's a way we can. It doesn't mean we have to be eternal enemies with people like the atheists are the bad guys and the Christians are the good guys, and it's not quite that simple. I think there's a lot of people that recognize the challenges, and how do we have that dialogue? How do we start that dialogue? What's the inroad to that?
Yeah, and to be clear, I wasn't in debate with Boghossian. He invited me to his atheism seminar up at Portland State University to lecture.
That was Portland State. Okay.
On reasons for God's existence and the rationality of Christianity. But then we had lunch, and then we ended up, in Utah at 4 universities.
Okay, then you ended up in Utah. Okay.
The pitch was a Christian and an atheist unite against the death of intellectual diversity in a university, how social justice and identity politics negatively impact culture in the university. So,
and that was well received, right? In Utah, they loved you there. The students were open-minded, and
well, it was weird, is what it was. We had one non-theist group try to shut us down because they called us logical fascists.
Yes. Okay.
Because again, even using logic or rationality or argumentation, you're using that to subvert the oppressed.
It's a form of white oppression.
To oppress with your hegemonic power and privilege. Of course, we were both white, old males, right? And I was a Christian. I had that one against me too. But then not only that, we found one Christian campus ministry group that instead of coming and joining along with us to talk about intellectual diversity, viewpoint diversity, the form of diversity that's missing on university campuses, they instead decided to hold a staff meeting so that none of their staff could attend and watch a video on white privilege and white guilt. And that's a garden variety campus ministry that did that. Wow. I've been disinvited by another garden variety campus ministry for being too woke or not woke enough. And I get invited by an atheist to come together. What the neo-atheists are starting to see is that if you don't satisfy the criteria of maybe these identity politic
Yeah.
clusters. Um, you don't fit the narrative. You got to get on board with that or get out. And they're starting to see that it's not just free speech, but cognitive liberty itself that's being stifled. See, Voltaire once said that I may disagree with what you say, but I would go to the death for your right to say it.
Mm-hmm.
Stalin, by contrast, says that ideas are more powerful than weapons. We don't allow our enemies to have weapons. Why should we let them have ideas? And that's where you get people like Antifa. When I walked him back to his office after our lunch and after lecturing in his class, his office was right adjacent to the Portland State University Police Department. And I said, "Why is your office here?" And he says, "I don't know. They won't tell me." Right? So he's up for woke-like ethics violations right now. And he's, in the hotbed of Antifa. And of course, Antifa is anti-fascists. That means they don't like fascism. They don't like nationalism. They are globalists. That's where critical theory and social justice emerged, and Neo-Marxism emerged in Frankfurt, Germany, right at the time that the Third Reich emerged. And when they were trying to peddle their new view of Marxism, their way to infiltrate religion and education through the slow, gradual, methodical process, suddenly they realized that Germany is not a good place to be in 1933 when the National Socialist Party came to power, and they're a bunch of globalists. All the leaders at the time were Jews and Marxists, or socialists, or Stalinists. And so when these anti-fascists, Antifa, name call, they're really just giving up their positions. They're coming from a Stalinist position, and Stalin was far worse than Hitler, all things considered. Yeah. So this is what you're seeing in the universities right now is oppressing not just speech but cognitive liberty itself. These are the thought police, not just the speech police.
Yeah. There's a lot of crazy things. Real quick story. It's funny when you were talking about Stalin. I remember I was when I was in the Soviet Union. I mentioned back in '91. We had a chance to. There was a lady who was a tour guide through some certain places that we got to visit, and she was her name was Ludmila. Ludmila was a wonderful woman. She's a great gal, and she was the official state certified tour guide, and she's like, "Yeah, you're." KGB's watching all the stuff we're doing. She's telling us stuff, and she's like, "This is, you got to be aware of this." And but she was interesting because she gave a number. She said that she put the number at Stalin's death at 80 million, which would be high by most counts. But I've always thought it's fascinating that here's the official state person giving us a very high number, but literally within a week, we left like on a Monday. I think the revolution was like on a Friday or something like that. Like we just missed the tanks rolling down the square by a week. And and so I think, and then I think back, maybe that's why she felt empowered to give these numbers and high numbers and say whether they're true or not, I don't know. In terms of maybe she just wanted to say bad things about her people, because she hated Stalin. But it was interesting that there was that sense of like, I can say this, but she was worried about being watched and the KGB and all this stuff. And you think about the campuses, and it's like, man, the idea that you're always watched by these groups is really concerning. You had that, a professor up in Portland. This one I saw a video on this from last year. There's a gal who was she literally had nothing to do with Christianity at all. She was just invited to speak, and all she said was there are biological distinctives between male and female. And literally the crowd erupts. She got some students rushed the stage. The professor, the female professor who invited her to come and speak, I think she had her either jaw broken or she got a tooth knocked out. I mean, it was something like, or concussion, something bad happened to her because she was trying to protect this gal, and police came in, and this wasn't even, these weren't Christians advocating a particular doctrine of creation or male and female, just saying simply, science is, she's just a biology gal, just saying, hey, there's some differences between male and female biologically. And she thought that was non-controversial, but to these students, like the Antifa style students, they're always watching, and I think it's concerning But yet here we are trying to have conversations, and I think Christians shouldn't be discouraged in trying to maybe make some breakthroughs, because you had some breakthroughs, with this, this atheist professor realizing, hey, we may disagree on a lot of stuff, but let's at least defend each other's right to say that stuff, and let's have at it in a public debate that doesn't dehumanize the other person or minimize or violate their rights. And I think
because our culture is starting to pursue not truth itself as something that corresponds to reality, but political truth. The Red Army used to use this term politically correct when a junior officer may ask the senior officer who made a statement, "Is that correct, sir?" And he says, "Does it matter? It's politically politically correct." So there's truth and there's political truth. This is the danger when we don't allow this viewpoint diversity to be able to flourish in our culture, is we end up having thought police, and hopefully we're not on the losing end of that.
Yeah, very true. That's one of the interesting parts about Ratio Christi and doing the ministry on campuses and being there. It's right at the leading edge, I think, of where all that's taking place, and an opportunity to make a real difference for professors and students and families who are sending their kids there to make sure the gospel has an opportunity to be heard in those contexts. So our time's real close here. Yeah. If there's one thing you could say maybe to close this out, whether it's a point of an inroad for somebody to have. So say a parent has their kid that's dealing with some of this stuff. Like, I have conversations, my son is in college, but he's at home right now like every kid is. But we have some really good conversations all the time about what he's learning in his classes, and we talk about all of these issues, and we're able to look through his stuff together and have these great conversations. And I've learned a ton about just having to try to dialogue with him about those inroads of, how can I say what I'm trying to say to him in a way that makes sense in the framework of what he's learning. And he's been super open. It's been great for his faith and also for my ability to communicate those things. But so you've done this for a while. What's maybe a hint or a starting point for a parent trying to get their kid engaged in these things, and to maybe not be afraid to bring up these things, but where do they start? What's the starting point?
Yeah, I really appreciate the Greek philosopher Epictetus, who says we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so that we listen more. For a parent, this is the case with their children. We want to be listening and understanding what they're saying and trying to interpret that through what we're seeing through the culture, because it's being captured by rhetoric. They're using common terms. They've captured the rhetoric of justice. They've captured the moral high ground, in a sense. Yeah. Hate or celebrate, right? And what would Jesus do? They've captured the sympathy, the emotions. And we want our kids to be able to think through the terms and what they mean. And so we want to be able to ask questions, and we want to listen to them and try to interpret that and get clarity. But we want them to ask these questions too. We want them to wrestle with these things, but we need to be having the dialogue. When it comes to having the dialogue with non-believers, or with people that are believers or non-believers, and they're engaged in this faux justice movement, this social justice movement, again, 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listening and asking good questions helps to bring about reflection, not deflection. When I'm putting my finger on them and telling them, I need to have a Socratic way of dialogue, asking questions. That helps reciprocate in conversation, them asking me questions back. But then I need to jump into the rhetorical apologetics, and I need to exploit those terms again. We need to be on the terms about ethics and recapture the ethical terminology including
Yeah.
recapturing justice and compassion. So we should be talking about oppression. We should
Yeah.
be talking about loving the downtrodden and the poor and things like that. And we should be doing something about it. But then we should be reflecting on why we do that. For Marx or many of these progressives, especially secular progressives, and that's what Marxism was. It's based on Hegel's philosophy of history and progress, right? Their religion is politics.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to show the ground for why we ought to be social activists. Why should we care about the poor at all? What basis in this worldview of naturalism is there to care about the poor? I mean, the lion doesn't look at the gazelle with a bloody foot and go get a first aid box and say, golden rule here, I feel compassion for you. No, it just eats him. The Christian worldview has a justification why all lives matter. Black lives, white lives, group lives, individual lives, preborn lives, postborn lives. And it's why in civilization you see the American Red Cross, Compassion International, the Southern Baptist social justice relief organizations, and the Salvation Army, and most of the hospitals having a religious nomenclature on them.
Yeah.
It's because that compassion motif is part of the DNA of the Christian movement. It comes from Christ himself.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of good starting points in there too. And I think you're right about just taking opportunities to let kids know, that we have compassion. I think, questions that came to my mind just even as you're talking is like, hey, well, we have compassion for the poor, but should we have compassion for the wealthy? And I think there's a difference. Again, I think one of those key distinctives, one of the guys that's done this show with me in the past for a while, Leroy, he's from Philly, big black guy, military, tough guy, he's a good guy, a good-hearted guy though, mostly funny. And I know him mostly as funny, but I'm sure he had to be tough at one point. He's probably weak now. If you're listening, Leroy, you are weak now, but you used to be tough. Anyway, so, but he can be called, because he has certain views as a Christian, he can be called the N-word. He can be called all kinds of racial epithets. And that's okay because he doesn't toe the line. He no longer gets the protections of his group that his group status gives him.
He's guilty of internalized oppression. He hasn't risen to, liberatory consciousness yet.
Yeah. So therefore it's okay though to, use language against him that would be against somebody else, considered, a fireable offense or discriminatory. And so I think that inroad for a lot of Christians is to recognize that while there's compassion for the poor, it's not compassion for all human beings that really social justice brings. So that's they pick the one group, but as soon as that group gets money, there's, do you have to have compassion for them anymore? And I think the answer is no. And I think that's where the big difference is yes, we have compassion, but that's not because we don't have compassion because they were poor. We have compassion because they're human beings who happen to be poor, And I think that's which comes first really matters in this discussion. So.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time. Hold on after a second.
Hanging out with you.
Yeah, it's good. This is our first real conversation, and we've had a few exchanges here or there on Facebook over the past year or so, and but it's good to see you face to face and get to know you a little bit, and I appreciate your time. So, hey, if anybody,
last name too, we're going to take over the world.
Yeah, I know the Millers. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to get connected with Ratio Christi. I was like, there's a Miller, I'm a Miller, it must be the right thing. It's God. It's a sign. But folks can check you out where real quick.
RatioChristi.org.
RatioChristi.org. Okay. So thanks again, Corey. Hang on after. I'm going to close this out, and I'll just give you a couple closing things off the air. But appreciate your time. God bless, man. We'll talk to you again. Maybe one of these days about socialism and how that connects with all this craziness and BART and all those things. So that'd be fun.
Sounds good, Joe.
All right. God bless.
Take care.